Let me ask you, what's a bad day look like? You know, my bad days, same as my good days, wake up, start with me waking up, hearing the alarm and thinking, I want to throw that thing out the window. But you wake up, right, you don't like the alarm, maybe your back's hurting, maybe you've got something you're dreading today, maybe you then get up, you spill milk all over the kitchen floor, the kids shout at you, you shout at the kids or your spouse or whatever, then the car breaks down, and then you get to work, and, well, it's work, and there's the people you work with, and then there's the people you work for, and then your colleague, or a customer, or whoever, asks you, you're one of them Jesus guys, aren't you? That's Spen Valley Church. And you think, you just sit there and you think, my day's bad enough already. You maybe explain, I trust Jesus for salvation, and I know I have life in him. Like, you don't believe in that nonsense, do you? What an idiot. And then you go home, there's nothing on telly, you burn the tea, and you go to bed and you think, hey, I get to do it all again tomorrow. Maybe that's life in a minute, right? For some of us, life is brutal, right? And that's not even the worst of it. There's a lot worse stuff. We struggle and suffer, I reckon, for probably 4 reasons in life. We struggle and suffer because we live in a broken, fallen world. You know, so we're poorly and life's hard and things go wrong and etc., etc. Number 2, we struggle and suffer because we do stupid things. Our sin and our choices impact on us. We struggle and suffer, thirdly, because people do bad stuff to us. People sin against us. And then fourthly, as Christians, we suffer because of who we are in Jesus. Other people treat us badly because of that. You see, Peter in this letter is writing to people who are going through that trial. They're going through it as Peter writes. They're going through the fire. He says in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, that they're going through this trial, and it's like, he says later, going through a fiery trial, being put through the fire to be refined. It's important for us to know that this is not what we all think straight away. As soon as we read about persecution or trials in the New Testament, we think of like Nero setting Christians up to be burned, right? This is not state persecution. Too early for that, probably. Right? This is the everyday being made to feel like we don't belong. That we've got it wrong. That the gospel's crazy. That you Christians are dangerous and to be thought less of. Not because the government said so, not because the media says so, just because our mates think so. Or our colleagues or whatever. And Peter's writing to them to tell them, you can endure in the midst of this difficulty. When life's hard and life's brutal, you can do it. You can live for Jesus. And it should blow us away that Peter is writing this to them, right? That Peter is writing this to them. Tracy read it to us, right? Peter stood by a fire to go through a trial of being asked if he followed Jesus by a little girl. And he chickened out and lost it. But now, because Jesus had lived and died and risen again, and Peter had been restored, he could write to them, the one who'd failed his trial by fire, and say, you can go through this fiery trial. He writes to encourage them with 4 big truths, or maybe 5, but we've only got 4, or 2 of them are put together, that he's learnt through that. And they're all here in these first 2 verses in miniature, and they're going to be worked out as we work through the letter, and we've got to grasp them. But before we get on to them, here's one thing to know. This letter is not written to you. It's not even written... Well, originally it was written to people 2,000 years ago, right? But it wasn't written to any of them as individuals. It's not written to any of us as individuals. It's written to and about a people. Again and again, we're going to see through this letter that, like all the New Testament letters, it's a corporate letter. It's to a people. These are truths that Peter's bringing out here to be believed and understood and worked out only as the people of God. This is not from the Lord to you or to me. This is from the Lord to us, this letter. Right? And so here we go. You will be sick of me saying this next sentence by the time we get to the end of May. Maybe Kevin saying it once or twice as well. Right? Here's what 1 Peter's about. If you want to write it down, get your pen ready. I'll say it a couple of times. This is what we're going to learn. We as a people are chosen exiles, known, loved, and enabled to live together for God's glory. We as a people are chosen exiles, known, loved, and enabled to live for God's glory. If by May we can't all say that off by heart, I've done my job wrong. Or you're not listening. One of the two. Maybe both. So, what then as a people? What are we? Let's look at them. We're going to break them down into 4. We'll put 2 of them together. Right? Because they're all here in these first 2 verses that to be worked out. So, as a people, as God's people, number 1, we are chosen. Right? It's there in verse 1, isn't it? Peter writes, Peter's an apostle of Jesus Christ. He's God's messenger. And he says to God's elect. Elect, we know what elect means, right? Some of us are going to go to May. Don't forget to take your photo ID. And walk up maybe to the Methodist Church or whatever. And we're going to elect somebody. We're going to choose somebody. That's what it means. It means chosen. He says it there in verse 2, look. To God's elect, verse 2, who have been chosen. Peter's not very tactful, is it? I mean, if you've read the Gospels, you know Peter's not very tactful. He puts his mouth in gear and then puts his foot straight in it, usually. But he doesn't realise that modern Christians argue about this, Peter. Can't you be more tactful? No, sorry. He just smashes it straight out there. He says, from the beginning, clearly in this letter, if you want to have confidence living the Christian life, particularly when it's tough, you've got to start with the only real solid foundation. You didn't choose God because you're awesome. We chose him because he first chose us, Peter says. You are God's elect. And here, this is the lesson we've got to get in that Peter wants us to get. It's that security of the Lord's sovereign choice. God has chosen his people. He has set us apart for himself. It's there in verse 2, sanctified, that's what it means. Sanctified by the work of the Spirit. Chapter 1, verse 13, chapter 2, verses 4 to 10, chapter 3, verse 15. He's going to tell us you have been set apart, especially for the Lord as his people. He bought us, he chose us because he loved us. Not because we're awesome, the opposite. So that he might have a people that he's going to lay out for us in chapter 2, verses 9 to 10. A people who are pure, holy, and imperishable. God chose us. That's how we can cope when life is brutal, because he chose us. Because let's just face it, if you're a Christian here this morning, you probably know this truth, that if it was down to you or me, we'd have jacked it in years ago. Because denying ourselves, taking up our cross and following Jesus is blooming hard, right? Mainly because we want life to be straightforward and full of fun. We want life to be where everything I want on a plate. Or at least to get the stuff I want because I've worked flipping hard for it. And then add on top of that your mates think you're weird and awkward or boring for believing all this God stuff. And then add on top of that you've got to be in a church with these people. What's the point? It's not worth it, is it? I haven't got the strength. It's too hard. But Peter reminds us here in these verses, the Lord has already chosen his people before the foundation of the world. That's what that word foreknowledge means. Be, for, and knowledge. 2 words put together. Before the foundation of the world, Mark read it to us in Ephesians. He chose his people. He picked us out and said, I love them so much, I want them. Chosen us for himself to bring us safely home as his bride. Again, we're going to see this in chapter 1, verses 3 to 5, chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. And here's the thing. When God promises to do something, it simply will be done. But here's the thing, for some of us here this morning, perhaps we think, well, that means I don't have to do anything. God chose his people, just go through life and it'll all be sound. No, that's not the gospel, folks. Here's the gospel. God is holy and just and righteous, and we have spat in his face and sinned against him and rebelled against him. But God in his love sent Jesus to live the perfect life, to die on the cross. That as we put our trust in him, we might have life. Each of us still bears that responsibility. To turn from sin and put our trust in Jesus. Hope in him, asking him for forgiveness, asking him for life. But if we're in Jesus, that people that God has chosen, along with the universal church around the world and throughout the ages, that people that he has chosen to be his treasured possession is us, Spen Valley Church. He has promised to keep us, whatever. And Peter tells us this truth here right at the beginning to remind us that it's not ultimately about us. We can depend on him because it all depends on him. And therefore we can face these challenges with rock-solid confidence that we are safely his. But let's be clear, these challenges will come because we are chosen, secondly, we are chosen exiles. These people literally are exiles. Peter says it there, doesn't he, in verse 1, to God's elect. Exiles, where are they? Scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia and Bithynia. You can go and read lots of commentaries and read lots of pages. Essentially, they lived in Turkey. There we are, right? And where was Turkey? It was a bit like Todmorden or Marsden or take your pick, right? It was that place that nobody really liked. They even called it Asia Minor, right? It wasn't near Rome, the centre of things where everything was hip and happening. It wasn't near Jerusalem where the Jews said the centre of the world was. It was the back end of beyond. And they were exiles, people scattered, especially the Jewish guys, right? He's writing to in this church. There were Jews and Gentiles in the church probably. The Jewish guys had literally been spread out. Go back and read at the beginning of Acts. But he's saying something more than just physically they live in Turkey. Just flip over and look at chapter 2, verse 11, how Peter describes them. He says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage wars against your souls. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they may accuse you of doing wrong, they see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." They're not just physical foreigners. They are spiritual foreigners and aliens living in a different state. Living with different rules because they have a different ruler, a different king. Because what does Peter say they've been chosen for? It's there in verse 2, look. Chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit. What does that mean? Sanctify is where we get the word saint from. It means holy, right? And what does holy mean? It doesn't mean you sit on a cloud with a harp. It doesn't mean you don't have any friends and you just look down your nose at everybody else. It doesn't mean you're boring. It means you're set apart. I've used this example before. We have lots of mugs in our house. Some of you are not allowed to use any of them. For example, Hannah is not allowed to use any of the ones that say Yorkshire Legend or Born and Bred on Yorkshire or whatever, because she's from the wrong side of the Pennines. It is sanctified, set apart, holy for people from Yorkshire. Yeah, well, she once gave me one that said from Lancashire and he was spat my tea out. Don't you start. But you get the point. It's devoted to a certain purpose, right? It's set apart for that. That is what the Spirit has done. He's set us apart, devoted us to God. We are God's special people. Again, he's going to talk about this in 1:13 through to 2:3 and 2:9 and 10. But what has he set us apart for what does holiness look like? Look there, verse 2. The sanctifying work of the Spirit to be, too many B's there, to be obedient to Jesus Christ. Holiness looks like obeying Jesus' commands. Right? He said that, didn't he? John 15, if you love me, you will keep my commands. But why do we have to live like that, set apart for God, to be obedient to Jesus? It's in chapter 2, verse 12, which should be ringing in our ears, members. It's one of our 2 verses, chapter 2, verse 12, chapter 3, verse 15. So that we might shine out the light of the glory of God and speak the gospel into the dark world around us. So that the Lord might save his people. We're to live as exiles, foreigners. Now, let's be really clear as we start this book, this letter. This book, we're going to work through for the next however many weeks, is not really about the everyday hardships of life, about getting out of bed and feeling rubbish, about your car breaking down, about etc., etc. It's about how we endure as we suffer for being part of the people of God. Whatever that looks like, to whatever varying degree. Right? Now, we can and we will apply it as we go through to some of those other things, to the suffering of just going through every daily life in a fallen world, to the suffering of bad choices, to the suffering of the sin of others on us. But it's not first and foremost what Peter's writing to these people or to us about. He's writing to a people being rejected, being laughed at, getting battered because they love and follow and display Jesus, because they look odd in a world that doesn't believe Jesus is Lord. Not odd because they're weird, odd because they follow Jesus. Doesn't mean you can't be odd as well. Here's the thing, the New Testament just assumes that to some extent or other, people will think we're weird because we're Christians. And probably even dangerous. If we live the Christian life properly. Remember, this is not state persecution here. It's just normal, everyday life. And it should just make sense, right? Sadly, in this country, we know all too well how foreigners and immigrants can be treated. Right? We know all too well, even in this church, how difficult it is sometimes to assimilate people from different cultures and backgrounds. And that culture clash comes. But that's the point of the church, right? Ephesians 3, that's how the manifold wisdom of God is declared as we come together under one King. And so it's probably important for us to admit that often we're not that cracking at living as foreigners and exiles, as 21st century Western believers. Too often it's a bit that we've gone native, right? We speak the local language. We love the local dreams and live for them. We hold the local beliefs. In some ways, perhaps as Christians, we look like we're living for the same as everybody else. And yet here's another problem for at least some of us, if not all of us. We look like natives, but we still live in our little Christian enclave. We're like natives who don't live among the other natives. Whereas the whole point, Peter says, chapter 2, verse 12, is that we live such good lives among the pagans that they might see God and glorify him on the day of his appearing. Instead of living for different dreams among the people, we're tempted to live for the same dreams separate from the people. That's going to be a key sentence as we go through. Hear that again. Instead of living for different dreams among the people, we're tempted to live for the same dreams separate from the people. It's amazing what you come up with in the pub on a Thursday night. But Peter is here to help us to live as foreigners and exiles. We're going to see this throughout. You see, he says forewarned is forearmed. If we're Christians, this place is not really our home. We're living for a new home. In the new heavens and the new earth. And that's going to massively affect how we live here and how we interact with fellow believers and other people who don't know Jesus. But he says, see, as he's going to tell us in chapter 2, verse 12, chapter 3, verse 15, see how much of an opportunity, see how much that is to be celebrated as well. And Peter, again and again and again throughout this letter, he's going to tell us, look, don't be surprised by this trial. Don't be surprised that you're foreigners and exiles. Don't be surprised if people treat you badly, because they nailed your king to a cross. In fact, we all did. He's going to tell us, look at chapter 1, verse 11. He said, he's talking about the prophets. They were trying to find out the time and circumstances to which the Spirit of Christ in them was pointing when they predicted the sufferings of the Messiah and the glories that will follow. We're going to find it in chapter 2, 21 to 25, 3:18, 4:1, 4:13 to 14. Again and again and again, he says, because Jesus is the ultimate foreigner and exile, we too can live like this. With great confidence, because united to him we need not fear, because as he told the disciples in John 16:33, he has overcome the world. In this world you will have troubles. Do not fear, I have overcome the world. And so he says we can trust the Lord in each and every circumstance that brings, because we're chosen exiles. Remember, as a people, we are chosen exiles who are known and loved. It's there in verse 2, isn't it? We're chosen, if we're Christians, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. Foreknowledge. Before knowledge. God knew us before the foundation of the world. We're known by him. And here's the thing. The way Peter's using that word, it doesn't mean just know about. You know, like you might know a Facebook friend. Or a celebrity. You know that person who has pictures of all celebrities up on the wall when they're a teenager? And they actually meet them, they're like, I know you. And they're like, well, I don't know you. It's not like God knows about us, lots of facts about us. He knows us in an intimate relationship way. Without getting weird, it's the word used that's now in the old versions of the Bible for Adam lay with his wife. Adam knew his wife. Doesn't mean exactly the same, but that intimacy is supposed to be there, that intimate knowledge. And look, it's that expression, this knowledge of that Trinitarian love, Father, Son, and Spirit. The foreknowledge of God the Father, we've been chosen through the sanctifying work of the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. That Trinitarian love, that relationship of God the Father, Son, and Spirit in setting us apart for himself by his Spirit. In Jesus dying for us that we might be sprinkled with his blood as the Old Testament people were, to make them part of the people. God is saying to these people, God is saying to us, if we know him, you are known. You are loved. I am present with you. So that we might know him. Look, Peter says, what does Peter pray for them at the end there? That grace and peace might be yours in abundance. God knows us that in all of life, the grace, peace, and abundance of life that Jesus brings might be ours. Jesus says, doesn't he, John chapter 10, verse 10, I have come that they might have life and have it to the full, have it in abundance. But here's the thing where it gets a bit more difficult. We like that, right? God knows me and he's loved me. Wow! But we're going to see throughout this letter that this foreknowledge in verse 2 is more than that. He not only knows us, but he knows and is at work and has always known and been at work in all of our circumstances to bring about his glory and our good. Even our trials and struggles and sufferings. Just look down at chapter 1, verse 6. In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little time you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which results even though refined by fire, might result in praise, glory, and honour when Jesus Christ is revealed. And it goes on and on and on. But do you get the important point there? These fiery, all kinds of trials, these have come so that. And then he talks about an eternal result. We're going to see it again in chapter 2, verses 4 to 10, chapter 4, verses 12 to 19. Imagine how this is going to be heard by people who are literally getting their heads kicked in for trusting Jesus, and worse. We're not alone. This trial, this difficulty, this horrific circumstance is not unexpected. It's not out of the Lord's control just because we feel like we are. We are loved, accepted, adopted, set apart. The Lord knows what he's doing. And that truth, if we grasp it, transforms every atom of life, especially when it's tough. When we feel all alone or abandoned, we can know that our loving Heavenly Father really has known us and loved us since before the world began. Right? There's a song there, think about it. And he's not about to stop now. When we're blindsided by criticism or pain or even a pandemic or setback after setback after setback, we can know that it's only a surprise to us. For the one who reigns over the universe is simply the next step in the plan to bring his people to himself, perfectly molded into the image of Jesus. What seems horrific and pointless to us, mind-blowing truth here, what seems horrific and pointless to us really is always God's good gift to us. When it feels like we simply can't take another step through this storm, we can come to the one who says, I am the Lord. The one who reigns in power. The one who rules with authority. And the one who says to us, as he said to Joshua, be bold and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be terrified. Why? For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. I know this can be hard to believe sometimes. Often doesn't feel real. We can't feel God's presence. It doesn't feel like he has the authority or the power to control this. It feels like those who are oppressing us, even when it's our own heads, have the authority over us, not him. It's hard to believe. Maybe they found it hard to believe. Getting battered all the time or whatever. But Peter says, when you find it hard to believe, look at the evidence. What does he say? You've been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God, sanctified by the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus Christ, and sprinkled with his blood. He's pointing us back there, right? What happened on first Passover night? What happened as the angel of death came to kill the firstborn sons? The people had the door sprinkled with the blood and they came out. What happened to make them part of God's people in the Old Testament? As the animal was sacrificed, what did Moses have to do there at the bottom of Mount Sinai? Sprinkle that blood over the people. Not because it's weird, but to say you are part of the people of God, cleansed by the blood, ultimately, of Jesus. This has already been worked out in his life. Again, we'll see that throughout the letter. Jesus, who trusted his Father's love, trusted his Father's plan, trusted that his Father really was always sovereign and always good, and therefore, on his face in the garden, prayed, not my will, but yours be done. Perhaps you don't have any confidence in this. Perhaps you just think life's out of control and I don't really believe this. Perhaps you don't really know Jesus. But Jesus says you can have confidence that life isn't just chaos. Life isn't just have fun and then you die. He says we were made to live in relationship with him, and he offers that relationship through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Will you come? Will you put your trust in him? Ask him for this life. But here's the thing, folks. Here's the question I was asking as I was writing this week. Perhaps you're asking the same question. Even if all that's true, even if we're chosen exiles, known and loved, how can we live this life as chosen exiles? I don't want to. It's too hard. I can't do it. We might be known by God. We might be loved by God. But I'm still a mess. We're still weak and sinful. We're not enough. We've got to finish the sentence. As a people, we are chosen, exiles, known, loved, and enabled. Because look what he says there, verse 2. You are chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. Grace and peace be yours in abundance. We're known by the Father. We're set apart by the Spirit. We're saved and indwelt by Jesus, who is what? Emmanuel, God with us. Nowhere anywhere in the Bible does God say, go and do this hard thing for me, and here's what, I'll make it easy. He says, go and do this hard thing for me. Go back to Moses in Exodus 3. Go and do this hard thing for me, and I will be with you. And this God comes to dwell in us by the Spirit as we trust in Jesus. And then God, Father, Son, and Spirit pours out grace and peace and life in abundance on us. That undeserved kindness of God, that peace in the midst of the trials, that life that enables us to live for him. We're set aside for union with Jesus, dressed in his righteousness, so when the Father looks on us, he sees us as we are in Jesus. The life we now live, we live in him. We're children of the Father. As Mark read us in Ephesians 1, we have the same power at work within us that was at work as God raised Jesus from the dead. And we have, as he's going to tell us in the next couple of verses, we're set aside for a hope and an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade away. And he's made us a people. It don't come across in English, but there's basically no singular, what do they call them? Pronouns? That's what they call them, isn't it? There's no singular ones in this. It's all to all of us. And about how we help one another and love one another to stand together in the face of suffering. We're especially going to see that in chapter 5, verses 1 to 9. And so Peter says, out of this outrageous love and grace and peace that has been poured onto us, we can live out our lives as exiles and foreigners and strangers in this world, living for our King, growing more like Jesus as we purify ourselves in obedience to him. Loving one another as the Lord has loved us. We're going to see those themes again and again and again. The lives Peter is calling us to live as foreigners and exiles are impossible in our own strength. Let's face it, we don't even want to. We'd all like to fit in. I've told you before, why am I doing Duolingo, even though it's a pain in the backside? Because when I go to France, I just feel terrified all the time. Because I can't communicate. I basically think I can talk myself out on most things. When I can't speak the language, I can't do that. We're the same in life, right? We want to fit in. We want to be one of the in crowd. Because it feels less difficult and painful. But Peter tells us again and again and again, because of Jesus' life, death and resurrection, because of the eternal hope that the Father has chosen us for, and is guaranteed by his Spirit, because the Spirit is always at work in us, sanctifying us, setting us apart, giving us power to be obedient, because of that Trinitarian work of the God who is in control with all authority and who is with us and for us in every circumstance, we can live lives that go against the grain. Both of our sinful nature and of the world around us. We can choose the life that looks like death over the death that looks like life. And so the call of 1 Peter that we're going to see over the next however many weeks is to be continually at work together to root this reality in our heads and our hearts. Look, here's what we need to get right at the beginning. Whatever anybody else says, whatever our own hearts say, we are as a people chosen exiles, known, loved and enabled to live for God. This is who the Lord God says we are. So when the world and our own hearts tells us we're weirdos and dangerous and boring, we beat into our own hearts and heads that reality that we are chosen as his beloved holy people for a purpose. We are secure and safe, for underneath and all around us are the everlasting arms of God. When the world in our own hearts tells us that we really should get on board with its agenda, we really should stop being so difficult. When it tells us its dreams are so much better than ours, they're full of sugar. They're much more satisfying. We beat into our hearts and heads the reality that we are exiles and foreigners who are called to live for the real, eternal, and lasting kingdom. Confident that our King has already won the victory and will bring us as a people, his chosen people, safely home. When the world and our own hearts tell us we're wasting our time and our energy and our money, that we are friendless and without hope, we beat into our hearts and our heads the reality that we are known and loved, with a Father who has planned out every circumstance as his good gift to shape us and change us and bring his people to himself as his own special loved possession. When the world in our own hearts tell us that this life is beyond us, that we're too weak, we're too sinful, we're failures, we beat into our hearts and heads the reality that we failures, we losers, we muppets, we sinners are the chosen people of God, indwelt by the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, given all the riches and resources of this loving covenant God who reigns for us, who goes before us, who goes with us to equip us for every good work as we live together for his glory as his people. Look, life is brutal. We are foreigners in a world that is not our home. But in Jesus, by the power of the Spirit, through the Father's electing love, we are the chosen people of God, known, loved, and enabled to live together as exiles in this world. That he might save his people, that he might really truly bring all these people safely home to himself. So let's pray. Let's actively work to pray together and individually that as we work through this book, this glorious three-in-one God might be at work in us together to enable us to live this life that we cannot live ever more boldly. That he might get the glory and he might extend his kingdom. Let's pray.